ओम नमः श्री यतिराजाय विवेकानंद सूरये सच्चित सुख स्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे. So we were discussing, we just completed the first chapter, which was entitled Yoga and its Aims. So 53rd, 51st, the 51st sutra was discussed, and then we had started the next chapter, which was entitled Concentration or Yoga and its Practice. So the first was about aims. And before I start the first sutra, which we had just begun, there were a few questions about the different types of samadhi, and maybe I'll try to answer them, though I don't remember all the questions that were asked. But one was that we discussed different types of samadhi, where one great wave of concentration in the mind, it takes up all the other thought waves, the smaller waves, and gobbles it up. All the samskaras, or past samskaras or impressions, the subtle impressions which are there in the chitta, are not allowed to come out, and they are gobbled up, as it were, and they are swallowed up. So when that happens, that prominent wave which plays an important part in our life, that is why we prescribe, meditation is prescribed where you focus on one particular object. It may be your ishta, it may be some idea, it may be some concept, or it may just be focusing on the awareness. There are different types of meditation, and depending on that, all you have to do, according to Patanjali, is to focus on one particular great wave of concentration, one great vritti, which is able to gobble up all the other vrittis whenever we want them to be under control. Now the problem is the waves keep on coming, keep on arising in our consciousness, and we don't know how to deal with them. So when we attain to a particular state where one wave, great wave of concentration is so prominent, like focusing on the Ishta mantra or the Ishta Deva, when you meditate or focus on some personality, of course, it has to be a personality which you should be able to uh, consider as a personification of Sat, Chit and Ananda. Any personality will not do. That is a better way of meditation. Though Patanjali does not mind if you take up any object, but there are different varieties of samadhi, which is a result of meditating on different objects, and at the same time meditating with content, without content, vichara, nirvichara. So all these things were a bit confusing. So we'll just see. But when we go to one particular wave, which swallows all other waves, still that wave has to be stilled. That wave, that one particular wave has to be still. And when we do that, we enter the highest samadhi, which we call Nirvikalpa Samadhi in Vedanta. Now the question was asked whether this Nirvikalpa is equivalent to Nirvichara, or because Nirvikalpa is actually a result or a Samadhi which is said to be seedless, because there is nothing else in the consciousness except pure undifferentiated consciousness. There it contains no phenomenal impressions at all in our mind. No seeds of desire or attachment, even remotely, they are not able to arise because they have been completely wiped off. This is a very, very rare thing, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, because Brahman, according to Vedanta, cannot become an object of concentration. When everything ceases, Brahman alone remains. It's not that Brahman is some object which you may use an Ishta or a personal god to meditate, which may lead to this non-dual consciousness or Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but you don't focus on it in the sense it is not an object that you can focus upon. When all objects go, what remains is Brahman. So Brahman cannot be, according to Vedanta, of course, cannot be known by the mind. It cannot be knower, nor it is the known. Brahman is pure, undifferentiated consciousness or awareness. And so in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, what happens is our ego and all the whole personality merges into this supreme consciousness, which is Brahman. Your real nature, uh, in all the layers of existence that we have, that become part of our self-identity. Our identity now is a complex of several identities. I have a body, either a white or a dark body, a particular race, I belong to a particular race, I have a particular name, a particular designation. So all these smaller identities, they merge into the entire universal identity or universal consciousness. So we all know it is so hard to follow Patanjali to such heights, even theoretically, to even imagine what will happen when we attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So we will try to recapitulate what we discussed in the different types of Samadhi. First, we have to start uh, training the mind to concentrate. That is how we started. Yoga, Chitta, Vritti, Nirodha. We went to the fundamentals of concentration, that there is Chitta, a thing known as Chitta, and it has certain vrittis. Now these vrittis are responsible for uh, different thoughts, different objects are perceived by us, different conclusions are reached. These are this is our lower identity. We identify ourselves in respect to the universe around us. And we have a concept, self-identity, with which we identify ourselves and the universe around us. So the concentration begins when we have this identity very strong. We have a very strong idea of who we are, who we want to be, or what is our intermediate goal, and all those things. But Patanjali gives you a warning right in the beginning that all this concentration is good provided it is done without any attachment. It must be accompanied by non-attachment. Otherwise, the concentration will get attached on a particular object, and then you can't take the mind away from it. And that is the result of concentration being misused to achieve some worldly purpose. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in great trouble. So this is the warning he gives. He doesn't say abhyasa alone. Practice is very good. We practice different types of concentration. But without vairagya, about which Patanjali, people tend to ignore this idea. When they take to yoga, they think yoga is something where you just attain concentration by some hook or by some crook. Or by hook or crook, you attain some kind of concentration. It doesn't really matter what object or what life you lead. It is not true. The more attachment you have, the more that concentration can prove to be dangerous, and it can lead you astray. So if we concentrate while remaining attached to the things of the world, we shall either fail altogether. First of all, we may not succeed in that concentration, or the newly acquired strength that we attain because of concentration will bring us to greater danger, because we shall invariably use it for our selfish ends, which will hamper our spiritual progress, inflate our ego, and we get more bound to the world than an ordinary person. An ordinary unconcentrated person may develop vairagya or may develop some kind of detachment, and there is some chance that he'll make spiritual progress. But if a concentrated mind is full of attachment to certain things, gross things of the world, they will get deeply immersed in that, and then it will take several lives for them to undo what they have done. The samskaras, they go on deepening, and the seeds in the chitta, the samskaras in the chitta become too many to be handled later on. So concentration has its pitfalls, which Patanjali has pointed out right in the beginning. Whenever we take up yoga, we have to remember this. Second is our uh, 20th century, you find there was so much progress made in external material science. That is only because of concentration. But at the same time, along with that, the scientists and the people who did it, they did not study these sciences with a degree of detachment. Something would make them more unselfish, because without detachment you cannot become unselfish. So selfishness slowly creeped in, the idea of nationality, idea of power, and then the secret of atomic energy, more and more powerful weapons. These are all the result of unlocking of the powers of concentration by people who are terribly attached to their property, to their nation, uh, to their wealth, and to so many other things which they find attractive. There have been wars in the olden days. People fought wars for the sake of women. So there are cases where you find terrible suffering is inflicted upon humanity by misdirected concentration. So uh, concentration, first thing is, concentration should be in proper hands. If yoga is practiced, unless it is accompanied by a certain degree of self-control or detachment, it can result in the subject or the person who is developing that concentration to become unregenerate, in his present unregenerate state or degenerated state. If he somehow manages to attain concentration, it is it it leads to more trouble than benefit. So what is the simplest way? Patanjali, does he give us a solution where we can get this non-attachment to the desires, the objects and ambitions, and then embark upon yoga? So one solution he gives is to cultivate an attachment to the highest object that we can possibly get, God himself. There cannot be a greater object of our pursuit, the pursuit uh, of which will relegate all the other objects and make them secondary in our life. Not that they will lose its significance unless the bijas are destroyed, unless the deep roots of attachment are destroyed. That is not going to happen. But at least if we focus on God himself, that is why meditating on a God who is pure, who is noble, any God concept of God or a personal God whom we consider to be holy, whom we consider to be loving, is always beneficial, because the lowest level, the gross phenomena, slowly, whatever little attachment we have accumulated over ages because of our wrong thinking, several lives maybe, these samskaras will slowly be uh, overpowered, or you may say it will be swallowed by this big wave of attachment. So by cultivating attachment to something which is beneficial, we directly or indirectly detach ourselves from the gross things. So take some great spiritual teacher or prophet like Christ, Ramakrishna, or any other major saint of any country or any religion. They actually lived on this earth. Maybe they lived in a human form, but if we read their lives, though we approach them as human beings, we suddenly find that they are far superior than what we know as ordinary human beings. They are full of love, they're full of compassion, they're respected, because we find that they are not attached, or they are unselfish because they are not attached to the world. So as we start loving them, we try to spread their message. Uh, can those qualities can automatically be imbibed by us in an unconscious way. So that is the easiest and the best way to model our life on these great prophets. By reading about them, by talking about them, by listening to them or listening to their words, and even trying to spread their message to other people. we focus on these people and their lives, and through this loving service and this love and non-attachment to other things, because there will be so much, we will be full of love, as Brother Lawrence said, I love my Jesus, I love my Christ so much that there's no place for any other love. So not that you don't love the world, you have a very good relationship with everybody, but at the same time you know that you will be attached only to God. Through this service, through this love, through this non-attachment to lesser objectives and goals, slowly this concentration deepens and it comes in a very natural way. That is why uh, loving a personal God is a very easy way. The path of devotion is very easy. It's not that we will become indifferent to other people, to our work or duties, but love for others is included in our ideal, which if it is into love for others in the sense the petty objects of the world, if it is included, then we will become possessive, we will become exclusive, will not become all inclusive. Our love will not be a universal love, but it will be a limited love, limited to you, your things around you, to your family, to your narrow circle of people around you. So that circle has to be broken. But because if we love the Lord, we become broad enough to embrace everybody. So as we work, and our work which we right now do, we can convert it into a sadhana or a worshipful service to that great ideal whom we revere, whom we love. It takes on a new meaning. The same work which we used to do for our selfish ends, maybe earning money, maybe doing some small jobs or even big things, if we do it for the sake of the Lord, then the same work does not bind us. It will no longer cause an attachment. Our attachment will be deepening more and more towards our ideal, but at the same time, the work will go on. So, through devotion to our ideal teacher or the ideal Ishta and meditation upon his life, we shall gradually come to an understanding of the spirit which is within man, because they represented lives which reveal to us the spirit, not the gross things. So when we take a spiritual ideal, we gradually come to an proper understanding of the spirit which is within man. So we slowly pass from the level of gross phenomena to subtle or spiritual level. We shall no longer admire a Christ or a Ramakrishna as human beings within time, like we consider other human beings. We shall worship them only as eternal spiritual beings. Otherwise, what we can as well love any other person on this in this earth, because we know they are temporary. They are not going to. They are not lived their life in the with the spiritual ideal. They were not. They did not convert themselves as pure spirits, as Sri Ram Krishna or Christ or Buddha did. So we have to know the divine aspect of the Lord and focus on the divine aspect. This is the second stage. But there is a third level or stage which is a result of deep concentration, because for even behind Christ, even behind Ramakrishna, even behind Krishna or any other Ishta we meditate upon, the conception of a personal God is there, but behind that is the Brahman, the ground or central reality, of which these figures are partial projections. It is like a window which takes you through which you can see the vast world outside. They will definitely, they are bigger windows, unlike the human beings, which are very, very tiny holes, if at all. So we can't see anything beyond that, beyond the gross. But fortunately for us, these incarnations are like huge windows. And when we look through that, we can get peep through these people into the infinite. So when we become, when we transcend through the window, when we actually come out of the window, we become united with Brahman. And that which actually manifested as Christ or Buddha or any other incarnation, on whom we meditate in the initial stages, took us a to a state where we realize ourselves as the infinite pure consciousness, even the idea of incarnation, the physical form of the incarnation melts. So this is known as Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So in the lower stages of Samadhi, a certain vestige of the sense of duality is still there. That is, I am meditating on my Ishta, my ideal. There is some kind of separation. It's natural that great people, great devotees, great saints find it very painful to surrender because they've loved their ideal throughout their life. And suddenly, if somebody comes and tells them that beyond that is pure consciousness, you give up that ideal which you held so dear for such a long time. So, that personal love for the ideal, in order to achieve the Nirvikalpa Samadhi, even the great saints refuse to accept that. That is why Sri Ramakrishna once said that even when every time I gathered my mind uh, to focus on, when Totapuri came and asked him to meditate on the non-dual or the impersonal Brahman, Sachidananda, he tried. But every time he tried to concentrate on the pure consciousness, he says, I came face to face with my Divine Mother. The form of the Divine Mother, which was so close to his, he loved so much, and he used to meditate so much on the Divine Mother, talk to her, interact with her, get almost everything that he did was for the Divine Mother. And suddenly, the moment he tried to free his mind from the consciousness of Mother, he did not have, he himself says, I did not have the will to go beyond. But at last, when Totapuri said, no, you have to focus, with the strength of his will, he says, the form of Mother, which again and again appeared in his consciousness, he cut it with the sword of knowledge. It's a symbolic cutting in the sense he destroyed it with the sword of knowledge. That this is after all a form which I used for meditation, which was so dear to me. But at the same time, I should know that the final goal is Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Then he says, at once my mind become Nirbija or Nirvichara, the seedless Samadhi, and I reached Nirvikalpa. It was beyond all expression, because naturally when you try to express that, you cannot do it through the words of the mouth. Sri Ramakrishna also could not do it. He could describe what is lower Samadhi. He could express by giving different examples. But when he says, what happens after attaining to Nirvikalpa Samadhi cannot be explained through words. But Nirvikalpa Samadhi has been described by Shankaracharya, who says that there is a continuous consciousness of unity of Atman and Brahman. So the other strange feeling that I am separate from Brahman vanishes, and there is a continuous consciousness, unbroken. It should be unbroken. Otherwise, Savikalpa Samadhi, where the idol or the ideal or our Ishta shines brightly, that still remains. But that difference between me and my ideal, the object meditated upon and one who meditates, they continue to be separate. But when that separation goes away, when there is no longer any identification of the Atman with its coverings, with the Stula Sharira, with the Sukshma Sharira, or even the Karana Sharira, because all the bijas have been burnt, all the seeds, samskaras have been burnt, then there is an experience, all sense of duality is obliterated. It's removed from our consciousness. Then there is pure unified consciousness. But what it is, unless we experience it, we can't know. The man who is well established in this, that means his concentration is unbroken in this particular consciousness, that ego never returns. That man is said to be free even in this life, and he is said to be an illumined person, one who has attained Nirvikalpa Samadhi. His bliss, according to Shankaracharya, is unending. It is not like the worldly bliss. We are happy at one time, sorrowful at some other time. He almost, as it were, forgets the world of appearances. Or even if he sees the world of appearances, when he comes down, he sees them as mere appearances. They don't entice him anymore. It's like the world looks like a series of shadows. It's a shadowy existence that he sees, and his mind is so much absorbed in the bliss of Brahman. Even though his mind is dissolved in Brahman, he is fully awake. He does not become unconscious. Otherwise, all unconscious people who have lost their mind, or people who have been given anesthesia, they would be realized soul. They don't attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Even though he is fully awake, he has to be fully awake, fully consciousness, but his mind doesn't trouble him. Mind does not create a partition between him and Brahman, and he is free from the ignorance of even the waking life. He is fully conscious, but free from any desires or craving, because all the seeds have been destroyed. Such a man, so that is the sign of a free man, that he does not have any desires or craving for anything. Such a man is said to be fully free in this very life. Now, when before this Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you see that all Samadhis contain a vestige of this sense of duality. That is very, very, very clear, that we don't want to part with our ideals. So even Sri Ramakrishna, as I told you, he would speak about his mother. He could not give up his mother. While in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, when he experienced his union with a personal Brahman, impersonal Brahman, on returning to normal consciousness, you will always find Sri Ramakrishna would speak of God in the aspect of the Divine Mother, whom he worshipped before attaining Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Not that he gave up his mother or the Ishta after he had known Brahman. It is important to remember this, because in our language, when we use the word real, it is used rather vaguely and loosely. When we say the world is unreal, it doesn't mean that it does not exist for us. Otherwise, Sri Ramakrishna would not have preached. It is unreal in the sense it is not eternal. It is not complete. It's a partial view of reality, but it is real. Because of lack of any other word, the word real and the unreal has been used. Then came the concept of Maya, which confused people. So when we say Brahman alone is real, we do not mean that everything else is an illusion, but rather Brahman alone is fundamental and all-pervading and omnipresent. The aspects of God, the divine incarnations, have their own relative order of reality. They are also real. Otherwise, you will consider, like some non-dualists do, they used to joke. Even Totapuri made fun of Sri Ramakrishna, said, why are you crying mother, mother, and going to the temple and all those things? They are all gross aspects you don't have. But even if they are gross, even though we start with the gross aspect, they have their own value in relative life. The materialists who say that they don't believe, they are down to earth, they are living in a they say that the spiritual people live in an unreal world. They just say, they complain, or rather they make fun of spiritualists or spiritual people when they say that they live in an illusory world. You see the world, there is the world to enjoy, why don't you enjoy? And we are down to earth people. You are living in an unreal world. Because the reason they do it is reason they do not believe in the spiritual realities, because they think the only existence that exists is the sense world. What we can't see, what we can't hear, what we can't taste, what we can't enjoy, it doesn't matter what it is, it doesn't exist. But we should also remember that when these sages talk about spiritual realities, for them there is another higher reality which they are actually living in. The world of gods, the world of forms that they see, the world of visions, the beautiful. From gross to subtle, there are several layers of perception. We can't say the gross is the only reality. They have their relative reality, but compared to the Nirvikalpa Samadhi, they are less real. But that doesn't mean that they are unreal. The subtle revelations or the subtle visions or the subtle commandments these people, the incarnations, share with us, they have their own reality, they have their value, they're tremendously important in our life, because they are the ones who serve as stepping stones to reach this Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So the illuminated saints, the saints that we see in the history of spiritual life, their experiences uh, are scattered. They range over a vast scale, from gross to subtle, from subtle to more subtle, from subtle to the causal, and finally the absolute Brahman. So there are gradations. That is why Patanjali takes pains to explain the different kinds of samadhi. Because in good people, in good saints also, you find different levels of experiences which are very true at that level. So we are traveling from lower truth to higher truth. Till we reach the highest truth of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, we have to accept these lower truths as a great achievements by these people, far, far above the gross world. They are far better than the pragmatists who think everything ends with the death of the body, who say that I don't care what happens, because as long as I live, I shall enjoy this world and make merry. Because if there was no higher world, there was no life after death, or even those who don't believe in rebirth, they believe in the final day of judgment. That means they believe in something that exists, for which you have to wait either to go to hell or heaven. Even in those Semitic religions where they believe in the day of uh, judgment, the day of the final judgment, even then that presupposes that our existence continues. It's not that it is going to vanish after our death. So materialists can't be relied upon, because according to them, uh, everything ends with death. So why does it really matter whether there is? But every culture, every religion, a majority of the humanity believes, they are afraid of the existence, that mystery still has not been solved. What happens to a soul after death? So as long as that idea of existence beyond death is there, we need spirituality, we need religion of different kinds. Every theory or every religious experience may not be the same. They can be different for different people, different cultures, different religions. But at the same time, we have to remember that these different samadhis, which or these some different intense concentrations, which Patanjali has described in all the sutras leading up to the 51st sutra, which talks of the Nirbij or Nirvichara Samadhi. That Nirbija Samadhi or Nirvikalpa Samadhi, as it is known in Vedanta, is the culmination of all our spiritual sadhana. But that doesn't mean that the other concentrations, provided there is a very important if or but, any concentration according to Patanjali without a vairagya, any abhyasa without vairagya can prove to be fatal. That concentration will take us in the opposite direction, instead of taking us from grosser to more subtle levels of existence. If you don't meditate on a higher concept of God than your natural state, if you consider God to be in the money, God to be in the wealth, God to be in the property, and if you focus your concentration on that God, there are people who consider the wealth and the things of the world to be their be all and end all. All their religion consists of worshipping that wealth which they think will give them eternal happiness, or those things of the world, the power, the glory, the great attainments, the name, fame, and there are many subtle. They may not be intensely gross, like that of a miser who is attached to his wealth as much as a saint is attached to his God or his Ishta. There are people who are attached to their wealth with the same degree of attachment. So uh, it is not the concentration. He may be intensely concentrated in a particular object, in wealth, for example, or in creating more and more wealth for himself. For them, wealth is the God. And in fact, that's why in Hinduism you'll find there are many gods who are worshipped for the fruits they bring. For example, people think which is a wrong concept that Lakshmi is to be worshipped. That's why on Diwali you see people buying gold and doing so many things. They think by worshipping God, our intense desire to become rich will be fulfilled. And they think by worshipping Lakshmi, we will get that. So their idea of Lakshmi, or their idea of different deities whom they worship with their own attachments and selfish purposes, not only does not give them spirituality, but takes them towards more and more gross attachments. And then it becomes difficult to extricate themselves. They find it difficult to extricate themselves from all the trouble. So one good idea or one good concept of these different deities. For example, we had this Kali Puja. Everybody celebrates, especially people of East India, and now it has become a fad to worship Ma Kali everywhere. If we worship Kali, if we really see the image of Mother Kali, you'll get an idea of a complete conception of God. We don't try to understand what Ma Kali stands for. What does she actually convey to us to that image? Now, the image, if you see, for an ordinary person, for a person with gross vision, it appears to be a terrible form of the goddess, because you will find her with there are 4 hands. If you see the image of Kali as she is normally worshipped, but there is a wonderful significance to that. So if we see, there are 4 arms. She has 4 arms. There is a left side and there is a right side. So people who have no attachment or who worship her for gross worldly gains, they are left-handed type of worshippers, which is known as Vamachara. And the right-handed is known as Dakshinachara. Sri Ramakrishna is an example. Ram Prasad and all the great Kali saints, they worshipped the right-handed side of, the right 2 hands, the 2 hands on the right. One hand gives Abhaydan. It gives you fearlessness. It is a protective posture. With one hand, the Divine Mother Kali is blessing you, protecting you against all the dangers of life. And the other hand is the hand which gives you boons. If you follow a dharmic life, if you follow a life of righteousness, of merit, of doing good to others, or leading a pure and spiritual life, then she may give you boons also. Little things unasked for may be granted to you. So that is the right form of worship. Whatever is necessary to sustain you, she will arrange, and she will protect what you have by that palm, which is the right palm, which is on the top of the right side, is that which gives you Abhaydan. Abhaydan means the boon of fearlessness. And the other hand, which is below, which is open like this, is the hand which gives you Varadan. Vara means it gives you certain objects of desire which are absolutely essential for you to survive. Not because of your greed, but because of your need. You need those things. Whereas the left hand is a ghastly reminder of what happens if we approach the deity for our selfish purposes. So on the left hand, you can see it is a sword, very sharp sword with blood, full of blood, and the other is the neck of a demon, which symbolizes that all your selfishness, if we approach the Divine Mother with a degree of selfishness, that will be the result. So the terrible aspect of Mother on one side, the benign and the benevolent aspect on the right hand side. Now we have to remember this when we worship Mother Kali. And there is Shiva lying below the Mother. The Shiva who is Supreme Brahman, and Shakti or Prakriti, which is neutral. There is a terrible aspect of Prakriti, which is a reality, which we have to accept. Whether we like it or not, There are terrible things that happen in life to everybody. To people who are gross and worldly, it may happen more, and to some people, it may happen less. But more or less, these both aspects of reality, the destruction of the gross is a natural way of life. We can't uh, uh, ignore that aspect, because whatever grows, whatever is created will be sustained for some time and has its natural span and will be destroyed sooner or later, whether it is money, wealth, property, nations, life itself is born to die. So without destruction, if you want God who can always keep on creating, then there will be a problem. So there is a balance in nature which has to be understood properly, and Prakriti shows through this image of Mother Kali that there is as there is this creation and sustenance, there is also provision for destruction. And the more we are attached to the gross, the more quickly the destruction will be. The more higher we advance and approach Mother Kali, then the other two hands, the right form of worship, leads us to great saints like Kamala Kanta, Ram Prasad, and even Sri Ramakrishna, who did not see the terrible, who worshipped the benevolent form of Mother Kali, because he worshipped her higher aspects with purity, with a lot of detachment. So, how to practice this and how to internalize this idea of proper worship? Though we accept both the sides, the terrible aspect of the Divine Mother Kali as well as the benevolent aspect, if we worship, the higher our worship, the gross people, they worship her. The dacoits, even the dacoits and the robbers in earlier days, they also had their own mode of Kali worship. They worshipped in the left-handed way because they were keen to uh, use bloodshed, use force to survive. They committed robberies, and then they just did not want to take the blame, so they started worshipping Kali. But then Kali will not protect them, in the sense they may get success in because of their concentration, but ultimately someday or the other the result is destruction. Any approach which takes us more and more towards the gross is bound to lead to destruction, which is indicated by the left hand side of Mother Kali. So that is the importance of trying to understand the concept of Mother Kali in a proper perspective. And that is what Patanjali tells us, that the more attachment we have to the gross, the more detachment we grow, the higher and higher aspects of Kali are revealed to us. And that same Kali who can destroy the gross can take you beyond and give you samadhi, as it happened in the case of Sri Ramakrishna. He got everything by worshipping the mother in the right-handed way. He Anything he wanted, he asked, and the mother granted his wish, because his desire was not to go towards the worldly or the gross. His only prayer to her was, take me away from the worldly, let me be more and more attached to your higher nature. I want to see the higher and higher manifestations of Prakriti or the Divine Mother. And he was shown different visions, he was shown the different forms, God with forms, through different religions, how different religions realize their goal of life. And finally, Totapuri comes and gives him the guidance or the knowledge of the highest Brahman. So even that was a result of worshipping Mother Kali in the right way. So the first whole chapter up to verse number 51 gives us an idea of what exactly a sadhaka should expect, how he should start by slowly doing abhyasa, practice, constant practice of concentration. As he reaches higher and higher level of concentration, he should develop more and more detachment. Otherwise, it will lead to destruction, as is symbolized by the left hands of Mother Kali. So he should be prepared for that kind of destruction. But if he follows the right method, according to Patanjali, the mind will be raised to higher and higher levels. And finally, if he is lucky, by the grace of his Ishta or by the grace of the object, by his own grace, grace of his own mind, he will be able to transcend and enjoy the highest bliss. So we will now come to the first verse, which we just, this was just to give you an introduction or a recap. This was just to recapitulate what we discussed in the first 51 verses of the first chapter, which defines yoga as yoga chitta vritti nirodha, and then explains why these chitta vrittis are so dangerous, why they are harmful, how to control them, and how not how to control them, but what are the different stages that a sadhaka passes through, and what is the final goal of yoga. So yoga and its aims, concentration and its aims, that was the subject matter of the first chapter of 51 verses. But now we come to the second chapter, which is more important because it is yoga and its practice, or concentration and its practice. That is why it is known as sadhana pada. So the first chapter was explaining and the purpose and goal of yoga. So, but the second chapter, which is known as sadhana pada, is nothing but trying to describe or trying to explain in great detail the small steps that we have to follow, the self-disciplinary steps that we have to follow to reach to this highest state of yoga, which was described in the first chapter. So Patanjali now begins a chapter on practice. They are collectively, these practices are known as Kriya Yoga, the first chapter, or Karma Yoga. Tapa Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga. So the first thing Patanjali tells us or asks us to do is to take some preliminary steps which are known as Kriya Yoga, which literally means work done towards yoga. Kriya Yoga means that yoga which takes you, that Kriya which takes you towards yoga. All work will not take you towards yoga, only Kriya Yoga. So what are the three words here? Tapaha Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhanani. Tapa Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhana. So they are self-explanatory, but if you see the Sanskrit meanings, we have to understand them carefully. So as we discussed last time, I don't mind repeating it. Tapa has a, normally in English, tapas means austerity or some kind of penance is meant. So it is like a forbidden sound, a sound which makes us feel, oh, we should not do this. It is some kind of austerity. And the moment you talk of austerity, people are discouraged because it assumes like the people who went into their cells. We are reminded of the old Christian tradition where people were supposed to go into cells and practice a sort of mortification or a discipline, self-imposed discipline, which normal people found it so difficult. So one has to understand what this austerity tapaha means. What does tapaha means? It is, for some people, austerity means some kind of mortification. You deny yourself certain things, you don't do this, you don't do that, you don't eat this, you fast, you most of these are known as penances, something which is used to chastise or to discipline the body and also the mind. But too much of focus on penalizing or chastising or even disciplining the body can be detrimental. So it is like something like a discipline where somebody asks you to refrain from doing certain things. So it is, in some traditions, it is known as Puritanism. Puritanism means you think I am a Puritan, I don't do this, I don't eat this. Especially the Vaishnavas and some forms of Christianity, they practice Even Vaishnavas are very strict. They say by eating non-vegetarian food or onion and garlic and vegan, there we'll find so many varieties of Puritanism which takes different forms and different names. I'm not against that. Anything that helps you to lead a healthy life, one should go ahead. But that is not what tapasya is. Not eating only vegan food or eating only this kind of food or that kind of food. Maybe it may be suitable for a particular individual, but that has should not be equated with tapasya. So this Puritanism, the word Puritanism, doing certain things for the sake of doing it. So my tradition doesn't permit me to eat this. Now, really, by not eating that, it may be harmful for that particular individual, but he does it because he believes that he's a Puritan. So that language or that translation of the word tapa is not good. By Sanskrit, the Sanskrit word tapas means in the primary sense, if you see the actual Sanskrit meaning of the word tapas is that which produces heat or energy. So tapas is something by doing which you produce some kind of heat or energy. Means a person who is depressed or a person who is uh, without any will or strength of mind or strength of body, the moment he starts doing tapas, it should regenerate his system and make him capable conserving the energy towards a higher goal. That is the idea. Now tapasya, why do we restrain? Why don't we waste our different energies? God has given us lot of prana in the kinetic form, lot of prana in the potential form. In the potential form, it is there. If you keep on, you can see if you don't eat food, or maybe even if you get a lot of cuts, a lot of bleeding is there, the person becomes weak. If he constantly fights and that injures himself, and there is a lot of bleeding or there is lack of nutrition, many things help to destroy the amount of energy that is available for spiritual practice. So first of all, whatever energy you have in the body and the mind has to be conserved. It's not just physical, it can be mental also. Too much of thinking, too much of attachment to many things, many pursuits in life, that can scatter your mind, and as in the process it will be a waste of mental energy. So whatever helps you to go towards the goal, to go towards higher and higher level of concentration, and if you do certain things, it helps you to save energy, then it should be pursued. That is the idea behind tapas. So you have to exercise self-discipline, not because it is some kind of mortification or something which you have to impose upon yourself because your tradition says so, but it is something which helps you to conserve the energy, which then can be used for higher levels of meditation or yoga. That is what tapas means here. So instead of taking the negative side of this self-discipline, many people don't do, when they are asked to do some kind of austerity or tapasya, I said, no, why should I? Let me just express myself, express all the desires, think whatever I have, just have a free mind and do whatever I like. Then it, instead of being joyful, it becomes negative, and then it creates problem. To stress the negative aspect of self-discipline is to contribute a lot towards a negative propaganda which is made in the name of religion. So too much of excessive austerity or tapas, if some religion prescribes, then you will find that many people would not follow this yoga or spirituality. They think, oh my God, do I have to deny myself all these pleasures of life? They find it such an unnatural. Their mind shrink with horror, especially the younger people. They don't like this idea. So unless it is understood clearly that so this kind of self-denial is just to conserve energy. For example, somebody is training to become a boxer. He won't be eating anything and everything. He has a trainer who tells him what to eat, what not to eat, how to conserve his energy, how can to build up his energy. He thinks it's a very natural thing, and he will undergo this kind of discipline because he wants to attain that goal of becoming a good footballer or a good boxer. He knows if he doesn't follow this discipline, he can't become. So why not for spiritual practices also? If our the spiritual practitioners who have followed a great tradition, if they tell us to refrain ourselves from wasting our energy in certain pursuits, or by eating certain things, or by observing certain things, if your energy is conserved, then why can't we do it for God? If we can do it for achieving excellence even in a single spiritual, a single sport discipline, we give up so many things, and we do that. Why can't we do? So that is the idea. Tapas is not something which should be taken negatively. It has to be understood as that self-discipline which enables you to conserve your energy and use it for higher purposes, not just for the sake of self-torture or an exaggerated mortification of the body, which some traditions insist upon. So Krishna condemns them. In the Bhagavad Gita, he says, those who know these men to be of demonical nature, who mortify or give pain to their body excessively without getting the sanction. The scriptures never say that these things are to be practiced. It is just to foster egotism or vanity. They think that, oh, we are superior people, we are performing this mortification, the whole world should recognize. So in their foolishness, they actually are destroying the sense organs. Instead of conserving energy, or they painfully torture the body, and Sri Krishna says they weaken the sense organs and outrage or create havoc to the dweller within the body, that is the Jivatma, that is the pure spirit which is there, that finds it difficult to express. So like Buddha, Sri Krishna also counsels moderation. Let there be moderation. Yoga is, for example, in one chapter he says, Sri Krishna says, yoga is not for the man who overeats, or not for him who fasts excessively. A person may fast a lot. Even fasting is not good, as Buddha found out. It is not for him who sleeps too much, or not for him who keeps or stays awake for a long time. Let him be moderate in eating and recreation, moderately active, moderately restful, moderate in sleep, and also moderate in wakefulness. So with this, we shall conclude today. And if there are some questions, I'll try to answer, and we'll continue with the sutra in the next class. Yeah. Swamiji, can you please share any simple method of meditating on God? The simplest method is take up a person whom you revere, person or a saint. Preferably it should be a great personality or a great avatara or a great saint, and try to meditate on him. The simplest method is to try to meditate on him as the light which enlightens your heart. That is the seat of our buddhi. So first the buddhi has to be awakened. That is why we recite the Gayatri mantra, which is just a prayer to the sun, that please illumine my mind, illumine my heart, as the sun illumines the whole universe. That is the meaning of the Gayatri mantra and all other mantras. All other mantras, when we meditate on a God in the heart, in the heart center within, and imagine or strongly visualize that he is removing the darkness of ignorance, gross ignorance, subtle ignorance, and the causal ignorance, because of which we make so many mistakes in life, take wrong decisions in life. So that ignorance, that prayer for removing that ignorance, along with visualization of the deity whom you love, about whom you have read, about whom you have a very clear picture. First thing is you have to read about that person. What is it about that saint or that prophet you like so much? And then his qualities, his actions, his leela, all these contemplations help you during meditation. That's the easiest way, uh, or is the simplest way of meditation. Second thing is, it's a specific question that does eating meat cause the consumer to receive bad karma? There is no question of bad or good karma. We eating vegetables, uh, if it is simply destroying life, then you are destroying life, even in the case of vegetables, or even consciously or unconsciously, we are killing so many organisms. By that, if you think that there are so many viruses or so many bacteria which are trying to live, we try to kill them. So you cannot entirely practice ahimsa in that way. But that food which suits you, there are certain things which invoke uh, the better side of human personality. If that food is really necessary to make you strong and make you a more nobler person and improve qualities, improve your concentration, then that food is good for you. So there are no restrictions, or there are no particular foods which are prescribed or which are not prescribed. There may be certain cults and certain groups which say that, but as a general thumb rule, whatever food suits you, whatever makes you more nobler, more pure, more unselfish, and more detached, and takes you towards higher and higher goals. And the quantity is important, as Sri Krishna said, don't overeat nor eat very less, so that your body loses all its energy. Just eat enough so that one can use that energy for higher purposes. Otherwise, if you eat too much, a lot of energy spent in prana is spent in digesting the food that you eat, the excess food. You really require a few calories, and that calories you can get by little food. So your energy is not spent in digesting the food that you have consumed. So if half your energy is spent in digesting a lot of rubbish that you put in, then it becomes very difficult to practice spirituality, because you have no excess energy left. You feel even after a heavy meal, you feel so tired, and you feel it takes away a lot of your pranic energy to digest that food. So you should eat that which is nutritious, that which you can digest easily. Each one has to find out his own food which suits him, suits his nature. Initially, how long should we meditate and how many times a day? You can meditate as many times a day as possible if you have intermittent working habits, or if you are having a very long day, then early morning and evening. It depends on the person. Whenever you get an opportunity to quieten the mind, to make the mind, the chitta vrittis, to bring them under control, whether you are traveling, whenever you have spare time, if you just try to remind yourself. That is why we hold all these classes. Every time you get an opportunity, and you don't know what to do, instead of whiling away the time, you can use it for meditation. It will always result in conserving energy, and for higher and higher types of meditation, it will promote that. So there's no rule as such. Concentration is the path of yoga. Of course it is. So somebody is asking, is the path of yoga? Definitely. Yoga means concentration. That's why I said the first chapter, if you see, if you attend the first lectures, those are very important. If you see on YouTube, I have posted all the lectures. I start from first sutra, where Patanjali in the second sutra itself, he says, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So concentration itself is yoga. Higher the concentration, the better yogi you are. Yoga has nothing to do with the ayoga which is popularly taught. It is just a outer covering, or just the preliminary step, asana. The steady body helps you to have a steady mind. But people forget the steady mind, people forget the concentration, and just spend their whole lives in pampering to the body in the name of yoga. So yoga is the path of yoga, the path of Raj Yoga. There is Bhakti Yoga, but in all the paths, concentration of mind is the result. Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Whether you do it by Bhakti, through bhakti, by meditating on a personal God, or through jnana, by discriminating between the temporary and the permanent, whichever method you use, the mind ultimately has to be concentrated. That is why this yoga, Patanjali's yoga or Raj Yoga, is known as the kingly yoga, the yoga which is the basis of all the other yogas. So chitta vrittis means the thoughts of the mind, now which are random, scattered and turbulent, have to be controlled. That is the entire goal and aim and goal of yoga. Okay, so I'll take your leave now. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.